Who runs America? I guess that's the $10,000 question, isn't it? Maybe it's the $10 billion question.
America and most countries of the world really are run by a very small percentage of the population.
Not even the President of the United States. It's the money men.
Obviously, the people in government aren't always the ones getting rich, so then you have to ask who are the ones behind it that are really getting rich, that are enjoying the benefits of this ripoff.
The interests of the American public have no bearing in the direction of the country, in the policy decisions. It doesn't matter which party we're talking about either. Republicans, Democrats, it's all the same thing. There's no voice for the people.
I think we're being controlled by a relatively small group of extremely powerful individuals that are pretty much pulling the strings behind both major parties, as well as the economic and financial institutions.
We're supposed to have the people being represented by the Congress, and this is a check and balance system. But instead, you have all branches of government owned by major corporations.
The folks who run America are the people who operate behind the scenes to make sure that the person who is in the seat of president and Congress and the people who we elect are the people that will do their bidding.
I think what you see is what it is, and who runs America are the banks and the multinationals. It's as simple as that, as I see it. And they're the ones that have made all the decisions that have put us in the place that we're in now.
In 1937, Ferdinand Lundberg, who'd been a writer with the Wall Street Journal and other financial publications, wrote a book called America's 60 Families. And in that book, he documented that the country was being run by an oligarchy of the wealthiest families, including the Mellons and the DuPonts and the Morgans and the Rockefellers and the Warburgs. And he showed that they were running the country as an invisible government behind the democracy that we see upon the surface.
In fact, a study by Princeton University has come out saying that the United States is more of an oligarchy than it is a republic or democracy. Why? Because the public has no say in the policies and in the system that's been set up by politicians.
In the late 19th century, wealthy monopolists, most prominently John D. Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan, were growing in economic and political power. Americans were increasingly alarmed at Wall Street's domination of both the Democrat and Republican parties. This led, in the 1890s, to the formation of the grassroots Populist Party. The Rockefeller-Morgan axis decided to distract Americans with a new enemy. Detectives often solved crimes by examining who profited from them. To help finance the war, the Rockefellers' National City Bank loaned the U.S. government $200 million. No income tax then existed. To help repay the loan, a telephone use tax was levied on the American people. It remained in effect for over a century. The loan was negotiated by Assistant Treasury Secretary Frank Vanderlip. After the war, National City Bank made Vanderlip its president. In that capacity, as we will see, he participated in the infamous Jekyll Island meeting, where the Federal Reserve Bank was secretly created. Mark Twain wrote,
"When the smoke was over, the dead buried, and the cost of the war came back to the people, it suddenly dawned on us that the cause of the Spanish-American War was the price of sugar."
The Rockefeller-Stillman National City Bank benefited most directly from it.
The Spanish-American War was the first war that persuaded Americans that the purpose of our military was not just self-defense, that we had to go overseas and fight wars on other people's behalf. And that became a pattern that continued ever since.
So without William Randolph Hearst, who championed this and who maybe was one of the people that stood to gain from the new possession, gain from the Spanish-American War, without him and without Hearst newspapers, there would have been no problem.
The phrase false flag, I think, is becoming more and more familiar to more Americans than it used to be. First time I ever heard that phrase, probably about 20 years ago, and I thought, what does this mean? I think many Americans are still in that category.
Well, first off, so people understand what we're talking about with false flags, that goes back to the days of the old sailing ships, and everybody had their country's flag, and the idea was, it took a long time for two sailing ships to approach each other, and so they wanted to get up close so they could attack, and so they would put another country's flag up. Say they were pirates, they'd put a British flag up and then get right next to you. Then they'd run up the pirate flag and board your ship. So that's where it became known as a false flag. The event seems to be something other than what it truly is.
False flags, when you cover them, first of all, it's a tough term to even use. Because as soon as you say false flag, we've started conditioning people to see that as conspiratorial. And when anything's conspiratorial, that means it's not true. Because if you listen to most media, a conspiracy theorist or conspiracies are all urban legend. They're all myths. When in fact, there are many, many conspiracies all throughout American history and world history.
It's not even controversial to say that the United States has used false flag because it's now documented. It's a part of history.
General Smedley Butler wrote a book after World War I that I've read, and I know many of your viewers have as well, War is a Racket. And indeed, in many ways it is. And I think that we have noticed over the years that some of the events that led up to war were not accidental.
I found myself going back and looking at World War I, World War II, the Vietnam War, everything. Could we have been lied to about everything? And that was my fearful approach to this is that even possible?
False flags have always been necessary to generate the kind of fear of outsiders or the imagined enemy that governments need in order to support the ridiculous policy of war in the first place.
Stage 1 is brute force. Stage 2 is staging something or creating an external enemy so that you then become the rescuer and people do what you say out of sheer fear. And then stage 3 is really getting to the point where you don't even require enemies any longer, where you can simply convince people through psychological manipulation to do the thing that you want them to do.
And because nearly every conflict the U.S. has been involved in the 20th century has been based on a false flag pretext event. That's how they got us into World War I. At the time, statesmen, senators, the American people in general wanted to mind their own business. They had a great industrial engine inside the United States. They were able to freely trade throughout the world and had no reason to engage in World War I. It wasn't their business. But unfortunately, the moneyed powers had other interests at hand.
At that point in the war, passenger ships and merchantmen were being armed. They'd been given orders to ram submarines. The submarines had no choice but to fire without warning.
I think the most stunning example where there is so much historical evidence that no one even challenges anymore is the attack on Pearl Harbor.
Every time that anniversary comes around, we focus on Pearl Harbor Day because we want people to know the truth and want them to stop buying into the lies.
December 7th, 1941. The Japanese Navy attacks the United States fleet at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, sinking or heavily damaging 18 naval vessels and leaving over 2,000 Americans dead. This is the event that propels America into World War II.
I had pretty much the same view that most Americans have, and that it was a dastardly attack. As President Roosevelt said, it was a day of infamy.
It goes down in history now for having been such a sad, sad time.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
Congress declares war, but the public wants to know why America was caught off guard. President Roosevelt appoints a commission to answer this question.
But we know behind the scenes that FDR knew quite a bit more. He was warned. And even behind that, FDR's shadow cabinet of advisors in the Council on Foreign Relations were provocating things behind the scenes. The American people were never meant to know the truth.
The attorneys presented proof that Washington had complete foreknowledge of the Pearl Harbor attack, but had withheld this information from the commanders in Hawaii.
We needed one thing which our own resources could not make available to us. That vital need was the information available in Washington from the intercepted dispatches, which told when and where Japan would probably strike. It is my conviction that action by the Navy Department at any one of these significant dates in furnishing me the information from the intercepted messages would have altered the events of December 7, 1941.
Outraged, the Navy court exonerated Admiral Kimmel and laid the blame squarely on Washington, D.C. The Army Pearl Harbor Board concluded Washington had full foreknowledge of the attack. Its report closed with these words:
Up to the morning of December 7, 1941, everything that the Japanese were planning to do was known to the United States.
But the American people did not learn the results. The Roosevelt administration ordered the trial verdicts to be made confidential.
He discovered later that his own superiors had gone to great lengths to make sure that he, Admiral Kimmel, did not have the information that was available in Washington.
Why was the fleet in Pearl Harbor? When Franklin D. Roosevelt ordered the U.S. Pacific Fleet to move from the west coast to Pearl Harbor, the fleet commander, J.O. Richardson, went to Washington and he protested this decision. He said, "Mr. President, our ships will be boxed in like sardines in Pearl Harbor. Hawaii is approachable from 360 degrees by potential attackers. We'll have to resupply across 2,000 miles of the Pacific." The only reason President Roosevelt could give Richardson for putting the fleet in Pearl Harbor was he said it would deter Japanese aggression. As of December the 7th, 1941, everyone knew that putting the fleet in Pearl Harbor did not deter Japanese aggression.
How did Washington know Pearl Harbor was coming? First, through decoded diplomatic messages. The Japanese used a code called Purple to communicate with their embassies and major consulates. Its complexity required enciphering and deciphering by machine. The Japanese considered the code unbreakable. But in 1940, U.S. Army cryptanalysts cracked it and devised a facsimile of the Japanese machine. As a result, U.S. intelligence was reading Japanese diplomatic messages, often on a same-day basis. Copies of the deciphered text were promptly delivered to President Roosevelt, as well as Army Chief of Staff General George Marshall and Secretary of State Cordell Hull. These messages revealed that the Japanese planned to rupture relations with America and had ordered their Berlin embassy to inform the Germans, their allies, that
the breaking out of war may come quicker than anyone dreams.
We were not going to go back into Europe because it had cost so many American lives in World War I, which was already dubbed the war to end all wars. Why would we possibly go back again when the American people knew full well it wasn't in their interest?
Pearl Harbor was absolutely necessary because, like all Democrats, FDR ran on a non-intervention and no-war platform. There's absolutely no way that the people would have again been sucked into this meat grinder.
So although that is not classically a false flag because the Japanese actually did the attack, it fits under that umbrella because we find out that the U.S. government wanted the Japanese to attack.
They left certain ships all next to each other so they could be more easily hit and got the more expensive and newer and more capable ships out of there so that they would not become collateral damage.
In Day of Deceit, The Truth About FDR and Pearl Harbor, Robert Stennett proved from documents obtained through the Freedom of Information Act that Washington was not only deciphering Japanese diplomatic messages, but naval dispatches also.
Like the Gulf of Tonkin, which was a fake false flag event. It was something that we were told occurred and actually didn't even occur. This has been called by some researchers, like David Icke, for example, as no problem reaction solution. You don't even have to have the actual physical event take place. You only need the perception of it to take place. In many cases, these individuals who plan these events, they're playing chess while we're not even playing checkers yet. We have to understand what they're doing. The event isn't as important as the underlying psychology that the event is done to elicit. And until we understand that pattern, we're not going to be streetwise to the technique.
Looking at these wars, Spanish-American, World War II, Vietnam, and Iraq, one could soundly argue that in each war, American involvement was based on a deception, false pretext, or to put it charitably, mistaken pretext.
One lie after another. Keep pouring them out. These are sick people and nobody wants to call a spade a spade.
Could this really be one giant coincidence? Patterns of this scale generally do not happen by accident. To find the answer, deeper questions remain.
When our country was founded, it was founded by an elite group. The founding fathers were the educated ones, the ones who had land, the ones who'd studied in Europe, the ones who'd read history and philosophy. And thank God it was that way. It's still true in America today, but the elite has changed.
It's a great debate of whether or not we're founded on our lineage and our heritage of the Constitution and Bill of Rights or from hidden interests.
Who runs the country? Well, the political parties run the country, but we all know the political parties actually don't do anything on their own.
I think the reality is that we're probably ruled, for the most part, by an oligarchy.
The people still elect members of Congress, but beyond that, once someone is in Congress, the special interest groups take over, the lobbying firms take over, very wealthy families take over, and the people have absolutely no voice.
A super elite, very powerful, very wealthy individuals who have, I will use the word, conspired together to take advantage of the opportunities afforded them in their positions of power and influence to determine the direction and the course of our country, irrespective of the wishes of the American people.
I think in any culture, in any country, you can look to who has the money. The people with the money typically tend to wield the power. And the best way to do that is to do it from behind the scenes, because then if people become angry with the way power is being wielded, they don't come after you, they come after the puppet standing in front of you.
We all know about a lot of wealthy people, Warren Buffett and Donald Trump, but these are the guys that you hear about. The people, they got lots of money, yeah, but the people with the real power, you don't even hear their names.
We start seeing all of these names of large corporations that come together over and over again, and then they get intertwined into events that take place, and then we start to see there's a pattern and there is a real agenda.
In America's 60 Families, Ferdinand Lundberg wrote,
"The United States is owned and dominated by a hierarchy of its 60 richest families, functioning discreetly in a de jure democratic form of government, behind which a de facto government, absolutist and plutocratic, has gradually taken form. This de facto government is actually the government of the United States, informal, invisible, shadowy."
Among the 60 families Lundberg named were the Rockefellers, Morgans, Mellons, Vanderbilts, DuPonts, Astors, and Warburgs. Through inherited fortunes, they remained entrenched in power from one generation to the next. These families frequently acted in concert to pre-select presidential candidates of both Republican and Democratic parties, and, as Lundberg documented, acquired sweeping ownership of America's major newspapers.
For the last several decades, let's admit, the powers that be have been the ones that have really made the decisions irrespective of the will of the American people.
This power structure has been called the establishment. Syndicated columnist Edith Kermit Roosevelt, granddaughter of President Theodore Roosevelt, described it.
Establishment is a general term for the power elite in international finance, business, and government, who wield most of the power regardless of who is in the White House. Most people are unaware of the existence of this legitimate mafia, yet the power of the establishment makes itself felt from the professor who seeks a foundation grant to the candidate for a cabinet post or State Department job. It affects the nation's policies in almost every area.
In America, in principle, power is supposed to belong to the people. Voting sustains the public perception that it retains power. However, the establishment has ways of getting around our electoral system. First, through their influence within the major parties as well as the media, they can usually predetermine the Democratic and Republican nominees for president.
For years, I would tell people, if you don't go vote, you haven't got any right to gripe about what goes on because you're just not even part of the process. But I've quit saying that because now, even if you do go vote, in many instances, it doesn't really matter.
The people have no real say, including in who is elected to office in this country. I mean, consider this. In the United States, about 50% of the population are no longer affiliated with Republicans and Democrats. So 50% of the population is not voting for Republicans or Democrats. Tell me which national election, member of the House, member of the U.S. Senate, a president has been elected in the last 100 years who was not a member of one of those parties. Now, how is it possible that half the country isn't voting for Republicans or Democrats because they're not affiliated with those parties, and yet those are the only two options that we still have? I mean, I think that demonstrates to people how corrupt the system is, because you are literally kept from having any other option and any other choice.
Because of the manipulation of the mainstream media, public education, most of the entertainment world as well as the political world, so many of the American people are sedated. They do not engage in the areas in which they could make a difference.
The good news is, I think we're hitting a tipping point where the people, you're now hitting critical mass. Obviously, when you have 50% of the country that's no longer a part of it, it just takes a very small minority now to really push things in a different direction.
We had George Bush trying to get reelected, and John Kerry was his adversary, alleged. As it turned out, there was massive electronic vote fraud in one of the swing states, Ohio. It turned out that John Kerry actually won. It was given to Bush. A year or so later, there's a young law student down in the University of Florida, and John Kerry is speaking down there, and the law student had the cojones to go over and get in front of the microphone when they opened it to questions, and he asked John Kerry how come he didn't make more of a squawk about this.
And he says you won the 2004 election. Right. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that amazing? You won in 2004.
It was obvious he had won. It would have made the difference between not only him being president, but what a different party would be in, and it was a very powerful question. You know what the response was? John Kerry gave a little nod or something, because the next thing we know, there's a goon squad of about 6 that come and drag the young law student right out of the auditorium.
However, the establishment has an even more powerful means of influencing the will of the people. The most important is the Council on Foreign Relations, or CFR, headquartered in New York City. Though virtually unknown to the public, the Council dominates cabinets of both Republican and Democratic presidents.
When you look at where the wires are connected to the centers of power, you will find again and again that places like the Council on Foreign Relations don't just float ideas, they provide solutions.
You often find members of the Council on Foreign Relations being appointed to various positions in government or industry for that matter, and you see them in the revolving door going back and forth between business and regulatory agencies and stuff like that. The big question is, how substantive is the CFR on global affairs?
Since its founding in 1921, the CFR has produced 21 Secretaries of War and Defense, 19 Treasury Secretaries, 18 Secretaries of State, and 16 CIA Directors. And what is the Council's goal?
The Council on Foreign Relations is a fairly interesting entity to me. And the reason for that is because they have so many members of the CFR who are in media.
I think the CFR exerts tremendous influence over our government, our media, and our centers of education, more so than most people would want to admit.
The Council on Foreign Relations is a very important nexus point, but it's just a vehicle for the larger aims of those who have an agenda. But it's an important vehicle. It's a ring of power that is an engine to encircle the whole world.
You know, once in a while there'll be a spokesperson on major media, and he'll be introduced as such and so, and they'll give credentials, and then they'll mention a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. But that just, it sounds so innocuous. It just passes, oh, it's some council that deals with foreign policy, so people don't remember that.
The number one thing people need to know is that when you have so many members of media who are a part of those organizations or that organization, you have lost the ability to have anyone criticizing globalist agenda or globalist viewpoints, because they are members of an organization that pronounces its view is to create globalism.
They have seized upon foreign policy, economics, and trade to get around the bounds of the Constitution and put their global system on top of America.
When I wrote The Shadows of Power, the main concern I had was that maybe I'd gone too far in attributing our foreign policy to this invisible government. Now it's 26 years later, we've had the arrival of the internet, I've had access to information I never had access to at the time I wrote that book, and my conclusion is that it's not that I went too far, but I didn't go far enough. When the Council on Foreign Relations was formed, the decision was made at a dinner at the Majestic Hotel in Paris in 1919 after the bankers got the word that the Senate had rejected the Versailles Treaty, so we weren't going to become embroiled in the League of Nations. So there was an organization created. It was in Britain, it was the Royal Institute of International Affairs. In America, it was the Council on Foreign Relations, like sister organizations.
These roundtable groups were put into formation to steer nations and steer their policies, rather than control them overtly through direct leadership. They worked through secret maneuvers. The Cecil Rhodes Secret Foundation Trust had been involved not in nation building, but in nation manufacturing in the southern part of Africa. And now they wanted the entire world.
Now, how do they control American government policy? The number one way is by serving as the recruiting ground for cabinet level positions. You've probably noticed that a lot of people in U.S. cabinets come from the big multinational corporations. How does that happen? The Council on Foreign Relations will invite executives from Citibank or Exxon or Halliburton or Bechtel into the council. They'll attend maybe a study group, attend some dinners, hear some speeches by people like Henry Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski. Now they become experts on policy, and now you see them showing up in the State Department or another major department. When you have one organization controlling the cabinet with a uniform viewpoint, whether the president is Republican or Democrat, naturally you're going to get uniform policies.
Here are some of the prominent members of the CFR, Council on Foreign Relations. George Herbert Walker Bush, Bill Clinton, Sandra Day O'Connor, Dick Cheney, Les Aspin, Colin Powell, Robert Gates, Brent Scowcroft, Jesse Jackson Sr., Mario Cuomo, Dan Rather, Tom Brokaw, David Brinkley, John Chancellor, Marvin Kalb, Diane Sawyer, Barbara Walters, Cyrus Vance, Paul Volcker, Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, Bruce Babbitt, Howard Baker, Samuel Berger, Elaine Chao, Dianne Feinstein, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Chuck Hagel, Gary Hart, John McCain, George Mitchell, Bill Moyers, Jay Rockefeller, Donna Shalala, Strobe Talbot, Fred Thompson, Robert Zoellick, Richard Nixon, Hubert Humphrey, George McGovern, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, John Anderson, Walter Mondale, Michael Dukakis, Al Gore, John Kerry, on and on. You notice, first of all, that you're talking Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals. You're talking people in every area of government and news media. You're talking education establishment. You're talking the key establishment institutions of the country are all infiltrated with Council on Foreign Relations members. Why is this institution so powerful that no matter whether it's a Republican or a Democrat in the White House, they are going to fill their administration with members of the CFR?
Admiral Chester Ward, former Judge Advocate General of the U.S. Navy, was a CFR member for 16 years. Before resigning in disgust, he stated the Council's objective.
Submergence of U.S. sovereignty into an all-powerful one-world government. This lust to surrender the sovereignty and independence of the United States is pervasive throughout most of the membership.
This is a man who was also invited to become part of the CFR and was a member for a few years until he recognized what the CFR was all about. After finding that out, he withdrew his membership from the CFR, and then he did his best to inform the American people as to what the CFR was all about.
The Council's journal, Foreign Affairs, has pushed for world government for over 90 years. In its first year of publication, 1922, it declared, "Obviously, there is going to be no peace or prosperity for mankind so long as it remains divided into 50 or 60 independent states. The real problem today is that of world government."
When you put all of that together, you recognize that the CFR, the Trilateral Commission, is nothing more but an elaborate attempt to, as they say themselves, make an end run around national sovereignty, diminish the independence and autonomy of the United States, and merge it into this global governing institution that they, of course, foresee themselves running.
I mean, my goodness, we're going toward everybody having a little bit and nobody having a whole lot, except for the elite. And we're going towards seeing all of our jobs taken away and put into another country. That's your world government for you. That's not benefiting the people in this country. So I absolutely abhor the idea of world government. And I'm afraid that what we're going to see is the demise of many of our countries in the attempt to formulate this one big structure.
And it's obvious to see there are these very rich and powerful people meeting under the guise of the CFR or the Bilderberg Group or a bunch of other things, but it really doesn't matter. The fact is the superclass exists. That's the problem.
So whether it's a Brussels, whether it's a World Trade Organization, whatever it might be, it's still built on the premise of how do we steal the most amount of money that we can, put it in the hands of the fewest, and tell everybody else what to do.
It's not primarily driven by political ambition, it's driven by economic ambition. And just the fact that I mentioned that might change the flavor of the conversation, because talking about economics is a little bit different than just talking about politics. And one of the reasons, again, that the American experiment here is not working too well right now as far as Congress is concerned is because Congress is not an economic animal, it's a political animal.
What is world government? Simply stated, one regime ruling the planet.
Problem is, are we going to do this voluntarily, and are we all going to agree that we're going to have a world government and that we all have some sort of representation and the thing's done equitably and fairly? Or are we going to have a handful of wealthy, egotistical, sometimes psychopathic people who want to control the world who are going to foist it off on us? And unfortunately, this is what's happening right now.
I think what any subject of the New World Order would have to be concerned with is who is going to end up calling the shots.
Countries act as a check and balance on each other. If one nation becomes despotic, another nation can rise up and stop it. If you had a one world government, it would set up the most unrestrained tyranny in history.
Already in the United States, with a population of over 300 million, you may be able to meet your representative, but your likelihood of knowing your representative as an average citizen is next to nothing. You may not even know who he or she is.
It only works in utopia. So while this is something we might all strive for, without a massive shift in global consciousness, it's impossible.
Such a development is less remote than it may sound at first. It is being established progressively now, modeled in Europe, where once mighty nations that oversaw empires such as Britain and Spain are becoming more like provinces of the European Union. Parliaments of EU countries grow increasingly subservient to the European Parliament. Laws are becoming more uniform throughout the Union. National currencies are consolidating into the euro. The European Court of Justice can issue arrest warrants against citizens of member countries. Advocates of world government are planning a universal version of the EU model for the entire planet.
When you give up your identity as an individual nation, what you're essentially doing is giving up the identity of your people and the individuals within your society. Now they're just part of this globalist worldview and they don't have value anymore. So when we see what's happening in the Veneto region, when we see Scotland now saying that they are looking for independence, when we see Catalonia saying they want independence, if you believe in individual liberty, you should celebrate those movements, because what those entities are essentially saying, as people, as individuals, we believe that we're more than just a member of your larger European Union, your larger global union. And instead, we want to be able to create goods and services, be paid for our labor, be paid for our work, and if we have to pay taxes, we should see a return on those taxes within our own communities. In a globalist world, you never see that return.
Globalists justify world government by promising peace and prosperity. Their traditional argument has been that nothing is worse than war, and wars occur because the world is divided into nations who keep fighting. They say if we replace nations with a world government, war would end, and mankind would live as one happy family in peace and prosperity. However, this pretext is flawed. Rudolf Rummel, Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Hawaii, published a study demonstrating that in the 20th century, 6 times more people were killed by their own governments than by wars. In other words, wars are not the deadliest thing. Governments are.
What we know from the 20th century, that in nation after nation after nation, governments that became extraordinarily powerful had a very disconcerting tendency to kill their population. So you can look, for example, at the Soviet Union. Under Stalin, 60 million people killed. You can look at China under Mao Zedong. Some estimates say well over 100 million people killed. Some even say 200 million people killed. You can look at Nazi Germany as the example that probably most viewers are familiar with. Example after example, even ones that most people haven't even heard of.
The problem with world government is the same problem as with any government. Government is control by force. The more you concentrate that power, the worse it is. You could make the case that world government might be only as bad as local government, but obviously the bigger, the more concentrated that exploitation racket becomes, the greater chance there is for corruption.
All human authority is jurisdictional and limited. So whenever you violate that and you create a regional government and then a multi-regional government and then a global government, by very nature you have squelched and expunged the fundamental tenets and principles of liberty, natural rights, freedom, sovereignty under the states, individuals. It's all gone.
If we had a world government, who would run it? Globalists like to point out that international alliances have defeated dictators like Saddam Hussein. But what if a man like Hussein took over a world government? Today, if a tyrant enslaves a nation, its people may hopefully escape to another country. But if a dictator ruled a world government, where could anyone escape? America's founding fathers recognized the dangers of concentrating power. They therefore split government power into three branches. In the founding fathers' original vision, the power of the entire federal government would be held in check by the states. Decentralization of power has spared Americans the oppression of totalitarian dictatorships that other nations have known. James Madison, known as the father of the U.S. Constitution, said,
"The accumulation of all power, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny."
If we follow the money to see who is behind the Council on Foreign Relations, it becomes clear that the U.S. foreign policy establishment is intimately linked to Wall Street and the banking establishment.
Thomas Jefferson, in a letter to one of his friends after he was out of office, he said, "Whenever public servants are paid by something other than what the people produce, the roles of master and servant are reversed."
It's the bankers, it's the heads of international corporations, it's the existing power structure. And people say, well, if we don't have government, we won't be protected from the evils of rich people. And it's like, no, I'm sorry. When you have a government, what you have done is put an army of enforcers at their disposal.
The United States is run like a major corporation.
The 20th century in the United States has been one of centralization, as it has been around the world. It's partly due to the rise of technology, and it's partly due to the consolidation of these banking powers.
So who really runs America? The global money paradigm really runs America, but the people, if they have consensus, and I think we can give several examples, the global food revolution is certainly one example where you see people from Occupy Wall Street and people from the Tea Party, people from all different segments of society coming together to say we want clean food. And you notice that this is maybe one of our most successful endeavors. So I like to think the truth is that the people in consensus run America, but if we don't do it and we don't spend time doing that, then the global money paradigm runs America like they run everywhere else.
Wilson presented his famous 14 points. The most important of them called for establishing the League of Nations. What were the bankers seeking in the League? World government. The Paris Conference produced the Versailles Treaty, which officially established the League of Nations. Ironically, though Wilson had proposed the League, the United States did not join. The U.S. Constitution stipulated no president could single-handedly make a treaty. The Senate had to ratify it. The Senate rejected the Versailles Treaty. Americans had helped win the war, but saw no reason to join an organization that might infringe on their sovereignty. When news of the Senate vote reached Paris, the bankers reacted swiftly. They held a series of meetings and resolved to form a new organization in the United States. Its purpose would be to change the American opinion so the nation would accept world government. In 1921, that organization was incorporated in New York City as the Council on Foreign Relations. The Council's original roster reveals that most members were bankers or lawyers affiliated with J.P. Morgan and Company. Since this looked unsuitable for a Foreign Affairs Association, the Council diversified its roster by adding professors. However, these came from universities receiving large grants from the Morgan interests. The professors, carefully screened, could be relied on to attend Council meetings, then return to the universities and preach the glories of global government. By the late 1920s, the Rockefellers had brought their people into the Council. One way the Council influences government policy is through publications, including many books and especially its periodical Foreign Affairs, a virtual instruction manual for U.S. foreign policymakers. Time magazine has called it the most influential journal in print.
We've been reading it for a number of years because of the jaw-dropping insight that it provides into what they're thinking. And they don't mince words in there. They will come right out and say that we need to have this form of control, we need to do this form of manipulation, we need to convince people of these certain sets of beliefs. And you read this, and it's written in a very highfalutin, erudite, academic kind of a style. So you have to get past that to really get to the gist and the meat of what's being said.
The CFR's most important means of controlling policy is supplying cabinet-level and sub-cabinet-level personnel to the government. What policies have the Council created? Let's take examples from after World War II. The League of Nations had effectively collapsed with the war's onset. Its successor was the United Nations, a bolder step toward world government. The UN began with a group of CFR members in the State Department. Working under Secretary of State Cordell Hull, they called themselves the Informal Agenda Group. The group drew up the original plan for the UN, then consulted 3 attorneys, all CFR members, who declared the scheme constitutional. Subsequently, they met with President Roosevelt, who approved the plan and publicly announced it the same day. After that, FDR made establishing the UN his top priority for post-war planning, just as the League of Nations had been to Wilson. At the UN's founding conference in San Francisco in 1945, most of the American delegates, 47, were CFR members.
By instituting policies through, for example, the United Nations, they're able to say, here's something we want to happen to every single person on planet Earth. And I'll give you an example. A couple of years ago, Bishop Desmond Tutu came out in support of a United Nations plan to number all the children. Their concern was that not all of the kids being born on planet Earth were making their way into a government database where they were being numbered and tracked. And so they came out with a program called PLAN that the phrase for this, their buzzword, was write me down, make me real.
The Bank for International Settlements, along with the World Bank and along with the IMF, have long been viewed as the engine of globalization. These have been the troika, if you will, that have impressed policies on countries all over the world to toe the globalist line.
We're told that this is necessary in order to regulate trade or in order to pacify nations that would be making war against us. But in fact, what this is about is creating debt.
People talk about the one world government or globalists as if we're just going to create one nation that all has the same name. But I don't think that's even necessary. We have banking systems that control the trade, they control what people do for a living. There are people who are living in African nations right now growing cotton in those nations. Those farmers are required to grow cotton because it's part of the debt payback that goes to these huge globalist banks who have made loans to the country. And they can't compete with other countries around the world. The farmers want to grow something else because their margins are so small, and they're not allowed to simply because of the debt that is owed by their nation.
The North American Union is just one proposal that some people see as an opportunity that's going to enhance their use of the racket to rip people off.
You're not going to get a world government overnight. What's going to happen is you will get regional governments. And of course, we've seen this with the creation of the EU and all of the trauma that goes with that they've been experiencing over there of trying to bring together multiple countries under a single currency, under a single economic system. Whenever people start talking about North American Union and linking us up, then I think, well, what's next? Then a South American Union, and then we join with the EU, and then before you know it, you actually have wound up with your global government.
North American Union is especially dangerous, as are many of these free trade agreements like the TPP. Why? Because they trump our Constitution.
What they have to do is they have to line up the regulations in countries to mesh together, to not fight each other. So you see this going on in Europe, you see this going on in Asia, you see it going on in the current negotiations with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, for instance.
The TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, aims to say that any American law, including any constitutional law, is suspended in place of the TPP. That includes corporations operating in the United States. They would fall under the authority of the TPP before they would fall under the authority of the U.S. Constitution. That's a huge problem. Same thing with the North American Union. Would we then have some agreement that trumps our Constitution?
It's all about regulation. You say, well, why? It's because they want to get them meshed together and lined up together so they can interoperate without national boundaries and national issues, you see.
We are the individual people of the United States. We need to exercise our rights. Nobody's going to come in on a white horse and rescue you or save the day. This is your job. This is an informed electorate's job. It's our job to inform our elected officials that we refuse to be a part of this plan.